Hello and welcome to America's Founding Up Close and Personal. My name is Dr. John Diamond and I am the host of the TV program America Unhinged. In Lesson 1, we learned about how a biblical worldview influenced the world governments in the 1600s and in the 1700s. Now in Lesson 2, I have been tasked with helping you understand the historical period between 1760 and 1776, a period that we will call the rumors of war. What we will learn is how a biblical worldview helped steer the colonists towards independence. But before we do that, we first must understand what brought our founders to the decision to declare independence from England and ultimately to form a new nation. Now, this decision did not come to them in 1776. The rumors of war actually started long before that. But in order to properly understand the legitimacy of the American Revolution, a brief understanding of constitutional government is necessary, for it is the basis upon which they did everything. Now, we must first understand the history of constitutions and why constitutions exist, and that is to restrict government power. One thing that we have to understand is that throughout history, mankind has been trying to restrict what governments and government officials are permitted to do once they come into power. Now, this has oftentimes come in a form of what we today call some sort of written constitution. The purpose of that constitution is limit the extent of the government power that official ultimately wields. Now, written constitutions date back as far as Hammurabi's Code, which is considered the world's first constitution. Biblically, we can go and look at the book of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 3, we see that King Nebuchadnezzar held absolute tyrannical power over the people. He served as king, lawgiver, and judge. Now, by the time we get to Daniel chapter 6, we see the laws of the Medes and the Persians actually restricted King Darius from repealing a law that he had passed. Now, by the time we get to the Roman Republic, we see that there were laws for what we would call constitutions put in place to protect the Roman citizens from acts of an unjust government official. Marcus Cicero was a very influential lawyer at the time during Julius Caesar's reign, and he really gave our founders a model of both statesmanship and republicanism and also natural law. Now, his influence can actually be found in the book of Acts. If you remember in Acts 22, when a centurion was committed to beating the Apostle Paul asked him, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned?" The answer was no. It was not lawful for this government official to beat a Roman citizen without a trial. As a matter of fact, a Roman government official could actually be put to death for committing such an act. So the Apostle Paul repeatedly called upon his rights as a Roman citizen to protect himself from violations against his civil rights. After the Bible, Cicero had one of the greatest influences on America's founding fathers. Modern versions of the Constitution, however, began in Christian Europe. In the year 1215, King John of England agreed to a charter drafted by the Archbishop of Canterbury, what is now called the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is a document which is the ancient foundation for both English constitutional law and eventually the American system of government. The Magna Carta did several things. It promised protection of church rights, protection of barons against illegal imprisonment, and access to swift judgment. A king who is guilty of violating constitutional law would be swiftly brought to justice by the people for violating their constitutionally protected rights. As a matter of fact, 7 times between 1327 and 1689, the English people forced out a sitting tyrannical king for violating their written constitution. In 1649, King Charles was actually tried, convicted, and executed for what the British called subverting the ancient and fundamental laws of this nation and establishing in its place an arbitrary and tyrannical government. Now, the last time that this happened was in 1689, when the British Parliament listed all the constitutional violations that King James II was guilty of, and then the people, through their elected representatives, removed him from office and replaced him with William and Mary. Now, the American people do not understand today that Britain actually had a revolution 100 years before the American Revolution. This is known in English history as the Bloodless or the Glorious Revolution of 1689. Now, the Glorious Revolution resulted in writing what we would call the English Bill of Rights. Now, this document became one of the most important documents in the political history of Britain and then ultimately in the history of America. Ever since that time, kings were not permitted to hold absolute power over the people without the consent of the people, a phrase that you will hear in the Declaration of Independence. Now, under the English Bill of Rights, the English citizens were guaranteed a representative type of government. Any power that the king wanted to exercise had to be approved by Parliament, which were the elected representatives of the people. Now, under the English Bill of Rights, all of the following acts were criminal if violated by their king without the consent of the people, which is a very important phrase. One is the pretended power of suspending laws and dispensing of laws by regal authority without consent of Parliament was illegal. Here's an important one. Levying taxes without a grant of Parliament was illegal. Keeping a standing army in time of peace to intimidate the people unless it was by the consent of Parliament was also illegal. And here's a big one. Protestants retained the right to keep and bear arms for their own self-defense, something we will see later in the American system of government. Therefore, since the American colonists were all citizens of Britain, they were therefore protected by the English Bill of Rights. And the American colonists, which were British citizens, understood they had a constitutional right to both impeach and depose of a sitting king for violating the provisions of their constitution. Now, with this historical foundation in English constitutional law, let's fast forward to the year 1760. Now, when one studies world and biblical history, you can't help but to draw the parallel between the Exodus story and the American Revolution. If you know the Exodus story in Exodus chapter 1, we read that a new king who did not know Joseph came to power in Egypt. But what this new king started to do, he became a tyrant. He targeted the Hebrews with a series of more restrictive laws until they were ultimately enslaved by the Egyptians. Now, this scenario will repeat itself in the years leading up to the American Revolution, because in 1760, a new king, George III, replaced King George II on the British throne. From 1760 to 1763, it wasn't much of a problem because the Americans were still fighting the French and Indian War, which was really a worldwide conflict as Britain and France fought over territories in the New World. But in 1763, after the British had won and the war was over, the British crown found itself burdened with a heavy debt that caused really a post-war recession. So in 1763, King George, motivated by the need to pay off the war debt and refill his English coffers, began to illegally tax the American colonists. In 1764, the king instituted the Navigation Act, which regulated all maritime commerce in the colonies. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act, placing high duties on the sugar and prohibited the importation of foreign rum. The Currency Act canceled all colonial currency, and Parliament took control of the colonial currency system. In 1765, the Stamp Act was passed, which taxed all paper documents. In 1766, the British Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, which repealed the Stamp Act and stated that the British taxing authority was the same on the colonies as it was in Britain. Now, the Declaratory Act actually hardened the British stance by asserting that Parliament had the complete authority to bind in all cases whatsoever, is the quote. In other words, any law we pass, any mandate we put out, you have to obey us or you will be punished according to the law. Now, in 1770, the Boston Massacre took place. The colonists confronted the British soldiers, and the American protest quickly escalated into conflict and war. The Americans were killed, the British soldiers were arrested and tried, but they were acquitted for firing on the colonists for the murder that they had committed. In 1773, the Proclamation Act stopped all expansion by the colonists westward. This was followed by the Boston Tea Party, and it was not about the colonists' second favorite drink behind rum. It was actually about taxation without representation, which was illegal under the British Constitution. In 1774, Parliament passed the Coercives Acts, which closed the Boston port, changed the venue for trials from America to England, and instituted the Quartering Act, which allowed British forces to occupy your house and be forced to be fed without payment. Now, the colonists' response to the declaration was the Declaration of Grievances. The response was polite, it was respectful, and it was to the point. We do not accept your coercive acts, and we demand that they be repealed. That was a right they had under their Constitution, a redress of grievances. But in April 1775, British marched on Lexington and Concord to take prisoner of Samuel Adams and John Hancock and to capture all the gunpowder stored there at Concord. The Americans fought and killed 73 British soldiers and wounded 174 more. On July 6, 1775, the Continental Congress adopted a resolution called the Declaration of the Cause and Necessary of Taking Up Arms, which explains why the 13 colonists had taken up arms in defense against this tyrant. In a letter from King George to Lord Frederick North on November 18, 1774, the king declared war on the American colonists, saying this: the New England governments are in a state of rebellion, and blows must decide whether they are to be subjects of this country or to be independent. And then from October 1775 to January of 1776, the king ordered the towns of Norfolk, Virginia, Charleston, Massachusetts, and Falmouth, Maine to be burned to the ground. The colonies were united by these actions, and our founders knew that independence was now the only answer. As a series of writings by Thomas Paine, known as Common Sense and the Crisis, swayed the colonists to declare independence. In a series of articles titled The Crisis, Thomas Paine declared the following: Britain, with an army to enforce her tyranny, has declared that she has a right not only to tax, but to bind us in all cases whatsoever. And if bound in that manner is not slavery, then there is no such thing as slavery upon the earth. Even the expression is so impious, for so unlimited power can only belong to God. Now, as the stage was set for the Revolutionary War to start, our founders turned to many influencers to develop our founding documents. But the writings of others throughout history also influenced the founders in very, very profound ways. Among them were John Locke. John Locke published a work called the Two Treaties of Government, and he wrote about religious liberty and how to appeal to the supreme judge of the universe to defend them against this type of tyranny. Montesquieu wrote about the spirit of liberty and the separation of powers. William Blackstone come along and he wrote about, he outlined the rights of individuals against government. Reverend John Wise spoke about the concepts of freedom, about civil power of the people, and the government's ultimate responsibility to cultivate and protect the rights of both life and liberty. As we have seen in this lesson, the colonists who supported separation from England were united in a bond between both God and with each other. Now, this connection could not be any stronger now. And although maybe not even a majority wanted to break from England at the beginning, by the end of this period of the rumors of war, most knew that there could be no other path. Now, there is no doubt that our founders were guided by a biblical worldview. As a matter of fact, on the same day that the Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress created a committee and designed a great seal for this new nation. The committee consisted of three of America's most prominent founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams. Their suggestion demonstrates the biblical influence that was underpinning their cause. Benjamin Franklin chose an allegorical scene from the book of Exodus, in which described in his notes as Moses standing on the shore, extending his hands over the sea, and therefore causing the same to overwhelm Pharaoh and those who were sitting in an open chariot, a crown on his head and a sword in his hand, raised from a pillar of fire in the cloud reaching to Moses, to express that the acts by the command of the deity motto, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Jefferson suggested the depiction of the children of Israel in the wilderness, led by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, to be at the front of the seal. As Patrick Henry said just before the Revolution, "It is in vain, sir, to extenuate the matter any longer. Gentlemen may cry peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war has actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why do we stand here idle? What is it that the gentlemen wish? And what would they have? Is life so dear or peace so sweet to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I don't know what other course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." My name is Dr. John Diamond, and this has been The Rumors of War.